Dennis Campbell's about to retire. He'll probably come through there. He's got 2 more weeks or so. But gone. We just got it in time.
Let me give you a little bit of information, a little bit of background about myself. I didn't know who was going to be here tonight. I thought that we might have some people that probably didn't grow up in the county, and you really can't discuss the history of law enforcement here in Prince George's County without being aware of what has transpired in the county. The county and then law enforcement followed suit. That's not the case, so I'm going to have to wing it a little bit. Give you a little background about myself. My name is Dennis Campbell. I'm a member of the police department. I've been with the police department for almost 28 years now. As already indicated, I'm getting ready to retire. I retire June 31st. Before becoming a Prince George's County policeman, I was a District of Columbia policeman for 2.5 years. You know, I frequently ask myself how I got involved in this project, and I come up with a multitude of different responses to that. But you know, in analyzing the situation, I think I got involved in it, searching for my roots, if you will. I'm curious as to how the police existed, say, back in the 40s, the 30s. How did a police officer investigate a homicide? Say back in the 30s, how did they investigate a homicide or a murder? Okay, back in the late 1800s, and I was curious about that, and I stumbled across a lot of this information doing the research on the book. Another thing, I should tell you how I got involved in this. Back in 1980, I was approached by the then chief of police, a man by the name of Jack McHale, who wanted to celebrate the department's supposed, and I'll emphasize that word, supposed 50th anniversary, 1931 to 1981. And he wanted to have a celebration. He knew that I was a history buff, so he approached me and he said, could you do some research on the police department and write up a short 2 or 3 page history of the agency? And I said, sure enough. And started to do some research, and what I found out is that the police department had almost nothing. Started looking around, and information was extremely difficult to come by. We had a few old photographs, we had a few names, but I was able to, after about 4 or 5 months, I was able to gather enough information where we ended up writing a little pamphlet. I think it was probably 5 or 6 pages long, about the early years of the police department. I went back and I talked to some of the old-timers, and when I say old-timers, I could only go back to about the early 1940s, and talked to a few people who were hired back in the early 1940s, and they were able to give me some information about some of the people that were around back in the 30s and a few that went back to the 20s. Went out and started looking for the families. There's an old photograph
I just moved you over to
in
that
the
table
book.
so you didn't get juice and things spilled on
There's an
you.
old photograph in the book that dates back to 1927, and there's a old touring car with six police officers in it. Photograph there. Okay, I was able to find the six police officers in there. I was able to find the next of kin of 5 of the 6. And I think I probably could have found the next of kin of the 6th if I had time. Again, getting back to my involvement, the chief knew that I was a history buff. I had an interest in the Civil War. I mean, you know, you're interested in the Civil War, this is the ideal place to live because you're right in the middle of it. As a result of that, I got interested in the Lincoln Assassination and did a tremendous amount of reading on the Lincoln Assassination. As a result of that, I became fascinated with something that occurred in Charles County in the early, 1861, the beginning year of the war. Charles County, during the first few months of the war, was occupied by Union troops, and they were intensely disliked. And what I did there, I went up to the Endicott Pratt Library up in Baltimore and searched some of the microfilm on the old Port Tobacco Times and read some editorials that they had written on the occupation, and that's what they called it, the occupation of Giles County by the Union troops. And it was extremely interesting to read in that you got a first-hand glimpse at how the local residents felt. And that came back to me later when I was working on the history of the police department. There is no definitive study of the history of law enforcement here in Prince George's County. Probably, absolutely, my best source of information is the newspapers. And I feel kind of awkward in saying that because in this day and age, police officers have an intense dislike for the news media. And what I found, and of course what you read in the newspaper, having first-hand knowledge of something that occurred and then you read it in the newspaper, it's an entirely different situation than what really happened. But what I found in researching information on the police department was that if you go back to the 1940s and the 1930s, when you read something in the newspaper, there's less speculation. There's a lot of speculation today. Journalists do a lot of speculating. There's less speculation when you go back to the 30s and the 20s and so forth, and they're more matter of fact. And what I was able to do with a lot of that, I was able to read the newspaper accounts and then go back and through other documentation to verify what was being said in the newspapers. And it was rather accurate for the most part. So, something, like I say, if it wasn't for the newspapers, I'd have been in deep, serious trouble. But I started talking about the Lincoln assassination. What had happened there is that came back also, and I'll tell you a little story later on, something with the relationship between the Lincoln assassination and what happened in my research as far as some of the techniques that were used in law enforcement way back when. Something else you should also be aware of is, the criminal justice system is just a carryover from the system that we had in England. Maryland is a common law state. We still charge people with what we call common law offenses, and they relate back to old offenses that occurred in England. And we don't do it very often, but Maryland is a common law state, and in fact, if you talk about murder is a common law offense in the state of Maryland. Again, you people attest to this much better than I can. One of the things that I came here in the 1960s, as we were discussing earlier, and as you're probably going to pick up, I am not a native of Prince George's County of Maryland. I was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts, and was transplanted down here in 1961, and I've been here since. But I consider this my home, and I'm just, again, I like making analogies, and you really can't make an analogy. I think of the way things were back home where I grew up. I grew up just outside of Boston, and there are obviously some old cities that surround Boston. Boston itself is an old city, but and they're older than what the cities are here or even this county. But they grew over a long period of time. One of the things that totally fascinated me was that Prince George's County remained in a state of limbo for about 100 years, and I have a little chart that I'm going to pass out here. It's kind of fascinating. And then it started growing, and the growth was uncontrollable, and government had one heck of a time keeping up with that. But let me pass these out. And, this is something that I put together, and I just found it to be totally fascinating.
That's all right.
Yeah, we got
I got plenty. I don't know who was going to be here. As you can see, if you go through this, 1800, there were 21,000 people living in the county in 1800. We go up to 1900, a 100-year period of time, and we have 29,898 people living here. So what that tells me is that in that 100-year period of time between 1800 and 1900, just 8,700 people moved into this county. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's just, you know, it just boggles my mind. As we get into the 20th century, you start to see growth. And of course, that's when the need for law enforcement starts to arise, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But you get into the 1940, we have 89,000 people living here, and by the end of 1940. And then you see this tremendous growth, and government had one heck of a time keeping up with this. I came here in 1964. I became a county policeman. And I remember what it was like trying to provide a service, okay, to 350,000 people with 275 police officers. I mean, it was really a nightmare. And Sarah, when did you come to work with the?
I've only worked in the county schools for 23, 24 years.
Well, you're right there. Then you know what happened too.
Right.
I mean, it's just a tremendous burden was placed upon government, and specifically law enforcement. I mean, we provide a 24-hour-a-day service, and to try to keep up with that demand was really difficult. We think of law enforcement. We think the first law enforcement officer in the county was the sheriff. The sheriff was, in colonial times, an appointed individual. The sheriff was also an extremely influential and powerful person. And some of the research that I was able to uncover was that, again, going back to the early colonial days, the sheriff was, in fact, so powerful that they limited his term of office to 2 years. He could not serve more than 2 years in office, and that was because of the power that the individual had. The office was usually held by people of substance. A lot of the early sheriffs were, in fact, lawyers. The sheriff also had a tremendous responsibility. He's described as the executive officer of the court. He's responsible for serving writs, subpoenas, warrants. Another thing that he did is he was the keeper of the jail. But again, if you look back at that, he usually hired somebody specifically to keep that jail. I think probably the biggest attraction to the job was that the sheriff was a tax collector, okay? And he was allowed under the law to keep 10% of everything he collected, so it was rather a lucrative position to have. And that was probably one of the reasons why it was a sought-out position. Prince George's County, being a rather big county, it was difficult in those days for the sheriff to get around. He was in Marlborough, again, attending to business, the business of the circuit court. And if something were to occur, if there was some type of criminal offense that occurred, he found it very difficult to go from Marlborough to, say, Chilham. Okay. Again, you know, it's an easy trip today, but back then we didn't have automobiles, and it was the idea of riding a horse or getting on a buggy and going to Chilham. So there was a hesitancy to do that, quite obviously. What happened way back when, and again this is a carryover from England, is because there was a hesitancy of the sheriff to go there, the county, the powers that be in the county, the county commissioners, had the authority to appoint constables. And what I was able to determine was that the constable was the individual that provided most of the community services. The constable was, again, making an analogy that I think the only analogy we can make today that is the constable was someone similar to the volunteer fireman that we have today. He wasn't compensated for his services. It was a service that the individual volunteered to do. He didn't wear a uniform. It was a part-time job, if you will. I say he wasn't compensated. There was no salaries. If he served some court papers, there was a fee that they were able to get. So the constable really is the individual that provided a community service. If you had and you wanted to make, if you needed a law enforcement officer, in all probability the sheriff was not the person that was going to come to your house. It was a constable. Now the constables were somebody that lived in a specific neighborhood. Constables were appointed by election districts. So, you know, over towards District Heights, you have the Spalding election district, if I'm not mistaken. And you'd have two constables that were responsible for providing a police service in the Spalding district. And they were your neighbors in all probability, that if you needed them, somehow or other you got in touch with them and they came out and they provided you with some type of service. In all likelihood, these really weren't educated people. They were probably just people that grew up in the area and probably made their living from farming. Later on, as we get into the municipalities developing, you see another term. You see a town bailiff. I don't know if you get that from District. You're from District Heights. I'm in Capitol Heights, rather. You had a town bailiff over in Capitol Heights. I've seen comments in the newspapers about that. And the town bailiff did exactly what the constable did. He served a law enforcement function in Capitol Heights. Again, no compensation. And this system worked great as long as the county was rural. But that started changing again as the 20th century came in. And problems arose, and they just weren't able to keep up with everything that was going on. Again, something we should mention is that I found extremely fascinating. You know, we have a population in excess of 700,000 people. We have some industry here in the county. If you go back again to the early part of this century, is that most people here in the county derive their living from the farm. They had something to do with a farm. I've talked to some of the old timers, and they would tell me, like over towards Hyattsville, we're just totally surrounded by dairy farms, as they would describe it to me. So most people here made their living through some agrarian means. I happened to stumble across some information just accidentally, a survey, or actually a census that was done in the late 1800s, I think 1893 if I'm not mistaken. A survey of industry in the state of Maryland, and there were some 13,000 manufacturing establishments in the state of Maryland in 1893. 12 of them were located in Prince George's County. Again, you know, farms. These young people today, and again, most of you can attest to this much better than I can. I see tremendous change occurring here since I came here in the 1960s. I mean, if you grew up here, you've seen a heck of a lot more than what I've seen. But a lot of these young people today can't visualize that. And again, I enjoy talking with young people, trying to tell them what this county was like. And again, that's primarily why I drew this job. The county that you see today is not the county that existed 25 years ago or 50 years ago. It's just, in fact, it's getting so that there's very, very little left of the county that was here 50 years ago. Very, very little at all. Again, the constable being the individual that primarily provided a law enforcement service. Stumbling across some information, how do they handle, say, a homicide in the late 1800s? When I say homicide, a murder that occurred in the late 1800s. I stumbled across an old murder story that's kind of fascinating to read. I got the information out of the Enquirer Gazette, an old issue of the Enquirer Gazette. And it relates to a murder that occurred in, I think, 1893 up on Largo Road, Route 202, just outside of Marlborough. A man by the name of Francis Bowie had a farm there. And it was Sunday afternoon, about 5 o'clock, he got on his horse and he went out and he had intentions of checking on some of his cattle and his sheep that were out in the field. He never returned home. His wife became worried. They sent a servant out to look for him. The servant went out to the barn and found the horse, saddled horse, at the gates of the barn. Okay? Mrs. Bowie obviously became very, very upset, and they went out and they kind of searched around, but it was dusk. This was in March, if I'm not mistaken, and they couldn't find him. She supposed that he had a heart attack. What she did the next morning, she went up to Marlborough and spoke with a justice of the peace. The justice of the peace, I'm supposing, was an influential person in the community. He was educated, he could write. And got together with the justice of the peace. They summoned in some of their neighbors. They summoned a couple of constables, and they went out and they started searching for Mr. Bowie. The paper goes into a lot of detail about the crime scene search. You know, we can say that they were probably unsophisticated at that time, but they really weren't. One of the things that we do as modern law enforcement officers, we go in and we do a crime scene search, and we do that very meticulously. We don't try not to overlook anything. And that's exactly what they did back then. And they found signs that there had been a struggle. They found a stick with some blood and some hair on it, and they found a hat. They found a watch. They found a pocket knife, which indicates that they really went over this crime scene in an attempt to find any evidence that might have been left there. They found Mr. Bowie had been dumped in a well. He had been beat over the head and dumped in a well. Started looking around, and they found out that he had had a dispute with a couple of tenant farmers. And they went to the tenant farmers, and one of them confessed to the murder. They went out and they locked but he involved the other individual. When they went out and they arrested him. Now the sheriff comes in at this point. The sheriff comes in, and actually you got the murder, and the sheriff is obviously going to respond to anything of that significance. The sheriff comes into the picture. The sheriff ends up making an arrest on this, and they try the individuals in the circuit court, and they convict them. One of them escapes. One of them is sentenced. Well, both of them are sentenced to hang. And the story goes that up until the turn of this century, is that they would hang the condemned in the back of the old jail. And it wasn't until the turn of this century that they did away with that, and they started conducting the executions, the hangings, in the penitentiary in Baltimore. They passed legislation that enabled them to do that. They were no longer local. But I think about 2 or 3 days before this individual was scheduled to hang, he escaped from jail somehow or other, and they found him a couple of days later, and kind of lost track of it then. But I'm supposing that later there actually was an execution. I'm going to digress for a minute, and there's a lot of old stories that you hear when you're talking with people about this. And there was one old story that I heard, and maybe some of you people have heard it, and you'll never read anything about this. But there was a bridge in Marlborough called the Hanging Bridge. Has anybody ever heard
the story? Yeah.
Have you heard that story? Yeah. I would say that there's probably something to that, because I've heard it from probably half a dozen different people. And one time I was actually given some information about some specific information. And there was I remember talking with a woman that grew up in Marlboro, and as a youngster, she said that she can recall her father coming home and telling her that she couldn't go out of the house that evening, that she had to stay in the house. And that she was later told that an individual had been hung from that bridge. Do you know where the bridge is?
I don't remember right now.
I'll tell you where it is.
Okay.
Fred has told us his tales.
Has he
about
told you?
that,
Yes, I didn't know he knew that. I didn't know.
Well,
Yeah, but a lot of people do know that. And what had happened later? Somebody else came along later and told me that he actually gave me the name of an individual that was hung from that bridge. Vermillion was the name. Okay, and he was supposedly a tenant farmer that had burnt down a barn. And of course, that was a hanging offense. I mean, because everybody was making a living, you know.
You were dependent upon that.
Yes,
to
yeah,
exist.
and supposedly, now again, you know, I don't know if this happened or whether it was just created, but supposedly this individual was a migrant worker and was hung from that bridge. But I picked that up from a number of people, and you'll never read anything about that. I don't think, but it's kind of interesting in that, you know, you can understand if you just get it from one person, but when you get it from a half a dozen different people, you probably think
I just thought of somebody else to
there's
ask about.
something to that. Another thing we talk about crime and punishment is that if you beat your wife in Maryland, it was a whipping offense. And it's hard to believe, but the last whipping that occurred here in Prince George's County for a man that beat his wife occurred in the early 1950s. And we were whipping people up. It didn't occur very often. It really didn't. As you get up into the you know, the mid part of this century, it didn't occur very often, but it did. Again, happened to stumble across a newspaper article, and it was in the 1950s. The date had been cut off, but you can, by reading it and some of the names in there, because of the names of some police officers in there, you could determine that it occurred in 1950. And he had beat his wife, and the judge had sentenced him to 20 lashes. And the sheriff at the time was a sheriff. That was the sheriff. Was his last name? Sheriff. Do you remember that? That was a name.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He used to own a liquor store over in 202.
202.
202,
Right.
yeah.
Sure.
But,
Was that unusual to Maryland, that you couldn't beat wives here in Maryland? Is that true of most of the colonial states or other states?
It probably was.
Yeah, I
It
think
probably
so.
was. Now,
But not
you know,
that way.
again, it probably happened rather frequently, you know, the further back you go. But as you get up to the 50s, it was rare that it would happen. It was, in fact, they had so much news media up there. When he left the jail, that they followed it. The police put him. Police didn't have anything. The whipping was administered by the sheriff, and the police, when he left there was all kinds of news media there. They put him in a car and they ran him all over the place, trying to get him away from the, according to the newspaper article, trying to get him away from the news media. I had read another article where. And this one dated back to the 30s, where an individual was sentenced to be lashed for beating his wife. And this individual was in the state penitentiary, and therefore was under the
Authority.
the care, if you will, of the warden of the penitentiary. And the judge had sentenced him to be lashed 10 times or something to this effect. And the warden had to do it, but it didn't. I don't think it happened. If you read the newspaper article, I don't think the warden ever administered the punishment. So it's something that faded out. But you know, it's something to think about. By this day and age, you know, you know, 1950 wasn't that long ago. 30 years ago, it really wasn't that long ago. And you know, there were a few people that actually got lashed. So it gives you some food for thought. County's population. Again, primarily a farming population. The District of Columbia, everything's, you know, again, trying to make an analogy, I think to have lived in Prince George's County, say back in the 40s, was like probably living in West Virginia today. That's the only analogy that I can make. It was out in the boonies. It was out in the boonies. To a certain extent. Because if you go back to those areas, especially on the north side of the county, around Hyattsville, that was always a somewhat urban environment over there. Bladensburg, Hyattsville, if I'm not mistaken, goes back to the 1860s, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere around there. So, but primarily it was a rural environment. Government, people were very, very independent people, from what I'm able to gather. They didn't rely on government. Everybody today relies on government. If there was a need for a police officer back, a law enforcement officer back in the say 1860, the sheriff again was 10, 15, 20 miles away, so you knew you couldn't get him for probably at least half a day at the earliest, if not a full day away. So if somebody stole your horse, what you did is you went out and you looked for your horse yourself. And again, a farming community, a large family, so you relied upon your family, you relied upon your neighbors. Again, a story that I happened to run across that goes back to the Lincoln assassination. And this one occurred out in Anne Arundel County, just across the county line, right off Central Avenue. There's a road, I think it's called Patuxent Road. It runs parallel with the Patuxent River. And there was a farm up there owned by some people by the name of Watkins. I can't remember the first name. But this guy Watkins was a captain in the Union Army. He was home on leave, and somebody came in and stole his horse, and it was his army horse. So when they discovered that the horse was gone, they went looking, and of course it wasn't difficult to find what direction the individual had gone. So they followed him up along Patuxent Road up to Governor's Bridge, across Governor's Bridge and into Collington, right up the road here. And they caught up with him at the Collington post office, and they arrested him. And Captain Watkins said that because the horse was a army horse, that it was a federal offense. It was a federal offense, and they decided to take him to the provost marshal in Baltimore. And they started up towards Baltimore and went through Crownsville. When they got into Crownsville, they stopped at a store to get something to drink. And this guy, his name was Boyle, this guy that they had arrested that stole the horse. He hit somebody over the head and made good his escape and got clean away. There was an intense dislike between Boyle and Watkins, and Boyle threatened to come back and kill this Captain Watkins. Well, lo and behold, about 4 or 5 months later, he come back and he went into Watkins' house and he shot Watkins and killed him at the farm right up here. The farm was there up until about 40 years ago. A family by the name of Hawes owned the property, and they just, Johnny Hawes told me that he remembers the farmhouse and was there until about 40 years ago. But anyways, this guy Boyle, after he kills the captain, makes good his escape, and he heads back down into Prince George's County, and he's going through Croom. And they go into the store and a post office in Croom, and it's that house is still there.
Just been restored in the post
Just
office.
been restored,
been
yeah,
restored,
still
yeah.
there. The name escapes me, but it's still there. They go in there and they rob that store. When they're coming out of that store after robbing it, there's some people outside and they get involved in a gunfight, and they end up killing one of the local people there. Make good their escape. They go across the Potomac, and this guy Boyle, his name surfaces during the investigation excuse me, of the Lincoln assassination. Dr. Mudd, when he was arrested and when he made his confession, indicated one of the reasons that he delayed in telling the authorities about Booth when he realized it was Booth. Okay? He didn't realize it was Booth right away, but when he did realize it was Booth, one of the reasons he delayed was that he was afraid of Guerrilla Boyle. Okay, and this is who this guy Boyle was. He was a member of the who was the raider over in,
Quantrill?
no.
Where?
There was a raider that kept coming across the Potomac. Well, he did a lot over in Virginia, up towards Loudoun County, Virginia. But he was a member of that outfit over there, and he had this reputation. And he grew up in Upper Marlboro. He's from Upper Marlboro. But anyways, after the war was over, they caught him and they tried him, and I think they convicted him, but they never did much of anything with him. And there's a lot of documentation on that. There is a lot of documentation on it. But again, you know, if something happened, the tendency was, rather than call on the sheriff, was to take care of yourself. Now, what they did, I don't know. I don't know if they, what they did. I don't know if they would have turned the individual over to the sheriff or what. But the tendency, today, we have a company. Today, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to call the police. But back then, that wasn't the situation. It just wasn't the situation. And again, talking with some of the old timers, it was just, they were independent people, extremely independent people. I'm getting a little hoarse. Can we just take a little break?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
How important was the hundreds here?
Okay, the hundred was like a voting district, from my understanding. We call it it's an election district. That's what 100 was. And the constable then would have been a constable rather in the voting district, rather the Spalding voting district would have been in that 100. That's my understanding of it. And that again, I've read a little bit about it, but it was a political subdivision,
Wasn't it for tax collection?
Yeah, tax collection, yeah. See, and a constable was appointed within a taxing district.
Yeah, it was for census and taxes and things
Yeah.
like that, yeah.
Government was also small up until World War I.
1941.
Yeah, and after World War I, the federal government began to grow, and as it began to grow, the new positions became available, and people started to migrate, I guess might be the appropriate word to use, to this area. Land in the District of Columbia increased in price, and there had been streetcars really running out into the county for quite a period of time. In fact, read Allen's book, I think not only Allen, but other people refer to the municipalities, Hyattsville and Mount Rainier and Brentwood as the
Well,
streetcar
there actually were
suburbs.
two strings of municipalities. The first ones were the railroad line, and the second
Yes,
was the trolley
yeah.
line. So.
Mhm. And there was I guess there was a trolley line that ran from Laurel right on down to 15th and Pennsylvania Avenue. So you could take a trolley all the way from Laurel. And as time progressed, Laurel got cut off and it ran out as far as College Park and so forth.
Well, Vic and I rode the trolley car to school with it.
Is that right?
From out
Yeah,
here.
yeah. And then you could actually at one time take a train, if I'm not mistaken, to Annapolis. In fact, tracks run right up the road here, or what was the right of way. So, as the federal government began to grow, people started to develop here in the county. Homes started to be built, primarily in the municipalities to begin with. Hyattsville had been there for a while. Mount Rainier, I think, came back in somewhere around 1920s. Capitol Heights, I think, somewhere in 1910. Somewhere along that line. But it's kind of funny when you look at that, is you have all these communities developing from Hyattsville, over in the Hyattsville area, and they come over to the central county, and they don't go any further south for quite a few years. As far as they come is Capitol Heights. And then, the southern end of the county was rather slow to develop. I don't think it really started to develop until the 1950s. But again, it was the growth. I think everything evolves around the District of Columbia. The growth of the federal government, the availability of transportation into the city. let's see, the availability of transportation into the city, and then something happened to coincide with that. The automobile came along, okay? And I find this fascinating that here you have this rural county that, you know, I live in a farm here in the Glendale area, and everybody that goes up and down the road, I know. And all of a sudden the automobile comes along, and I see these strangers going up and down the road, and they're driving 40 miles an hour, okay? And there's automobile accidents out there. Thefts start to occur. The constable, who is a volunteer, doesn't have access to an automobile. He's not making enough money. He's running a farm. He's not making enough money to buy an automobile. So these people are coming in. They're committing traffic offenses. There's thefts that are occurring that never occurred before. The constable isn't capable of handling this. We need something else. And what do they look at? They look at the District of Columbia. And the District of Columbia has a police department. They've got a professional police department that they've had since 1861, first year of the Civil War. And that's why they had a police department, because you had all these troops coming into the District of Columbia and raising hell, and they needed a police department. They didn't have one either until 1861. So there's this hue and cry, if you will, for a professional law enforcement agency that the constables just aren't able to cope with it. You got the sheriff now, who I told you really could only stay in office for 2 years. The sheriff really never had an opportunity to professionalize, because he was just, it takes you 2 years, so you're just barely beginning to realize what's going on. And again, I think there was a hesitancy for the sheriff to get involved in providing a law enforcement service. So again, the people are moving into the municipalities. The county, this county, probably more so than other jurisdictions, they didn't like the idea of increased taxes. And the county would have had to have increased the tax in order to hire full-time police officers. And this county has always rebelled, if you will, against taxes. Rebelled way back when, and it's rebelling today against increased taxes. So the powers to be, the county commissioners said, you know, most of the new residents are living in the municipalities. It's the municipalities' duty to provide that law enforcement service, and that held on for a while. That's why you get the Prince George's County has more municipal police departments than any other county in the state, and that's where that goes back to. As the people started to go beyond the boundary lines of the municipalities, then the need arose, and the county couldn't walk away from it for a county police service. One of the things that I talked to, regressing, going back a little bit further, you may have heard, has Fred ever told the story of Coxey's Army? Have you heard the story?
I'm familiar with it, but not from Fred. No.
Yeah, okay. Fred did a paper.
Really?
Yes.
Did he? I didn't know.
Yeah. Fred did a paper on Coxey's Army. Coxey's Army goes back to the late 1800s, about, I want to say about 1893 or something along that line. A man by the name of Coxey, can you remember his first name? It escapes me. By a man by the name of Coxey, who was a businessman, and I guess probably a socialist. He had some radical social ideas. The country was going through a recession. A lot of people were unemployed, and Coxey had an idea of how he could employ thousands and thousands of people through some federal programs that he wanted to initiate. Coxey was from Ohio. He decided to march on Washington, D.C. to present his ideas to the Congress. So he put together a group of people, and this group of people were really, I guess, what we would call hippie types today. An oddball configuration of people. And I guess Coxey and his immediate lieutenants were really oddballs. One of them is said looked like Wild Bill Hickok and so forth. And anyways, they marched from Ohio to Washington, D.C. over a period of about 3 months. And they would encamp along the way, and the news media followed them, so there's a lot of documentation about what went on. And the news media, I make the analogy between Coxey's army and what happened here in the late 60s and the early 70s with the hippies and so forth marching into Washington, D.C. They marched into Washington, and they were going to march over to Capitol Hill. Well, they were met at the boundary. They came through Montgomery County, and they were met at the boundary line by the D.C. police and by the Capitol Hill police, and they were told that they couldn't demonstrate on Capitol Hill. Well, Coxey was going to demonstrate regardless of what he was told. So they marched to Capitol Hill, and there's probably 500-600 marchers with them at that particular time. As they marched across the country, they'd pick people up and they'd lose people and so forth. Desertions as they would call it. But they marched over to Capitol Hill and they demonstrated. And Coxey and a number of his people were arrested and charged with walking on the Capitol grass and demonstrating on Capitol Hill, which was against the law way back then, and it's against the law today. So his group went over into southwest Washington, 400 or 500 people, and encamped over there. And of course, there was a health problem. Okay, with 400 or 500 people in a big field somewhere, there was a health problem. The District of Columbia authorities said, "You can't do this. You've got to leave." So they left, and they came out into Prince George's County, and they ended up right at the Bladensburg-Hyattsville boundary line, where Free State Cycle is today, Baltimore Boulevard. They encamped right in there. Well, the locals were very, very upset because this was a weird configuration of individuals, and they didn't like it. They were allowed to camp there by an attorney, and I want to say his name was Harris, but I may be mistaken. But he was an attorney, and he was representing Coxey, and as a result of that, he had allowed Coxey's followers to encamp on some property that he owned over there. And the local residents marched on this attorney's house and told him they didn't like these people here, and he explained to them it was part of his representation of of Coxey. Well, they stayed there for a while, and then they moved down the road a couple of blocks, and they encamped behind the George Washington House, or the tavern. Okay, and there were problems there because there were liquor available, and they started drinking back there, and they were there for a week or so, and we had some rains. And you know what happens, or used to happen down there when you had rains. Well, they were flooded out, and they went up. Somebody else came along and ran a tavern up over towards Coleman Manor somewhere, if I'm not mistaken. And they went up over there, and again, this is over a period of several weeks, and the people are very, very upset. They kept going into Hyattsville, and the mayor of Hyattsville had a couple of confrontations with them, and the sheriff came down, and he had warned them that, you know, if they didn't get out of the area, they were going to be arrested and so forth. And there were a lot of ill feelings between the local community, specifically the people in Hyattsville and Bladensburg and the members of Coxey's army. Well, they moved over there towards Coleman Manor on another farm, and again, these were destitute people. They had nothing, I mean, and they were evidently, because they had no food, they would go out and they would raid chicken coops, and the farmers were losing chickens, they were losing eggs, and again, this just incited the local population. The governor was contacted and asked to send the National Guard in, or the militia, to move these people out. He really didn't want to do that, but they stayed here almost all summer long, and it got so bad that Coxey actually gave up and left town. He went to trial in the District of Columbia on the charges there, and he was put in jail for a week or so, and then he came back out. Things were really bad over there, so he said this is a hopeless cause, and more people were coming in. And evidently the people that were Coxey and his so-called lieutenants were evidently, they couldn't get along with the new people who were coming in, so the new people had gone over to Roslyn, Virginia, and camped over there. And there were several hundred people over there. But again, Coxey finally gave up, and left, but his followers stayed there. There was a meeting between the sheriff, the state's attorney general, the governor, and some local residents. And as a result of that meeting, the governor went back to Annapolis and contacted the chief of police, for the lack of a better term, and it wasn't his title. I want to say it was Commissioner of Police in Baltimore City. And we had no state police at that time. Okay, we had no state police, and we didn't want to call it the militia. The Commissioner of Police for Baltimore City, up until maybe 30 years ago, maybe less than that, 25 years ago, was appointed by the governor. It wasn't appointed, and that goes back to the Civil War. Governor contacted the Commissioner of Police up there, and they sent about 80 Baltimore City policemen down here on a special train. They came down, the train stopped at Hyattsville, they got out, they marched over to Coleman Manor, they surrounded the encampment, and they arrested everybody in there for vagrancy. They took them back to Hyattsville, to a Justice of the Peace. He tried them all, found them all guilty, and gave them 90 days. They put them on the same train that bought, this all happened the same day, put them on the same train that had brought the Baltimore City policemen down here, took them back up to Jessup, stopped at Jessup, unloaded them, put them in the House of Corrections at Jessup, and the Baltimore City policemen went back to Baltimore City. Quite an interesting story, and Fred had wrote a paper on that, and he had all of his information came from newspaper accounts, and it's quite interesting to read. Interesting thing about that is that here we have the Baltimore City Police Department providing a police service outside of Baltimore City. They were acting as state police, and that policy really continued. Here again, this is 1893, somewhere around that period of time. Later, what I found out is that, jumping a little bit ahead of myself, when we do have a county police department, we have a small county police department, 4 people to begin with, 11 people a little bit later on. They had no investigative expertise. When we had an unsolved homicide, and I give you some specific instances, say in 1931, there was a homicide that occurred that was kind of complicated. It wasn't an immediate arrest. We didn't have the expertise to investigate that. What we do is they would send detectives down from Baltimore City to investigate that. And that went on all over the state of Maryland. I've read about a similar situation that occurred up in Annapolis City, where the Baltimore City Police, because of their expertise, they were the first full-time police department in the state of Maryland. And they go back to the mid-1800s, and they had some investigative experience. And then when you had a particularly complicated crime, they were the ones that more or less investigated it as if they were state police. And that went on right up through here in Prince George's County up until sometime in the mid-1930s. It went on. And I know of some specific cases that maybe we can discuss a little bit later on. But we get back again into the period of the 20s. We have this influx of people coming into the county. We have automobiles running around, and there is a need. There is a need for a full-time police department. They passed some legislation in 1927 that allows the county to form. Annapolis passes some legislation that allows the county to form a county police force in 1927. They end up hiring 4 people. 4 constables at large was the title. The chief of police is in fact the sheriff to begin with. Problems immediately arise at this point. The police officers are county employees, if you will, being paid by the county commissioners, but their supervisor is an elected official, meaning the sheriff, and the county commissioners have no control whatsoever over the sheriff. totally unworkable situation. There's friction almost right away between the county commissioners and the sheriff. Somebody was mentioned Herbie Machen, the father. He is appointed as the sergeant of police, and for some reason he has a confrontation with the sheriff, and the sheriff says, "You're fired." County commissioners say, "You can't do that. Only we can fire." And he can't. That's very specific in the law. So, Mr. Machen remains. This is political type thing. There's a lot of that in this particular period of time. So almost right away, those efforts begin to separate the county police from the sheriff. This occurs in 1931, where they pass legislation which increases the size of the police department from 4 to 11, and it allows the county commissioners to appoint their own police chief. So that happens in 1931.
They go to uniforms right away?
Yes, right away. Uniforms and automobiles, although I don't think they purchased automobiles. They were authorized, it's funny, they were authorized to buy 3 or 4 automobiles and 2 motorcycles. Okay. And I don't think they'd ever bought the motorcycles. I don't think they bought the automobiles right away in 1927. In 1931, they do buy 11 automobiles, 11 1931 Fords that we were talking about earlier. They paid $572 a piece, and they bought them from several Ford dealerships. Again, we were talking how Mr. Machen, who was the sergeant on the police department, owned a Ford dealership. And he sold them, I think, 2 or 3 of these automobiles, and you couldn't do that today. It'd be a conflict of interest, but, it wasn't a problem back then. Very, very political. Very, very political. There was no test to be appointed as a police officer. The appointments were, in reality, political appointments. And you really can't even call it backroom politics, because it wasn't. Six members of the Board of County Commissioners? Five. I think there were probably at that particular time maybe 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and they had it divvied up where the Democratic Commissioners could appoint, say, 8 of the 11 policemen, and the 2 Republican commissioners could appoint 3. I mean, and this is coming out of the newspaper. I mean, we call it backroom politics, but it was really up front, and that went on. And for a long period of time.
Was that true until the commissioner's system?
No. It was in a certain way, and we can talk about that as we go on. But everything was political back then. We
No,
talk,
but I mean, did that system continue up until the 60s?
It diminished, but I don't think I think it existed to a certain extent, limited extent in the 60s, but it diminished. In 1936, they had a scandal within the police department, and they ended up firing half the police department. And of course, half the police department was 6 or 7 individuals. And what had happened there was that U.S. Route 1 was the main north-south route for the East Coast. If you stopped an individual that lived in the District of Columbia or Delaware or Virginia, they weren't, for a traffic violation, they weren't entitled to what is called a personal summons. They were taken directly before a justice of the peace, and they had to post bond. Well, the police would stop people, take them before the justice of the peace, take their money, and then split the money with the police officer, okay, and never log it in. And I'm oversimplifying it,
Yeah,
okay, but that's what happened, okay. and they got caught at it. And they ended up charging, I think, like 6 policemen, a justice of the peace, 1 justice of the peace, and a bondsman, okay, with criminal conspiracy. They all went to trial and they were found not guilty, okay, but it turned the police department upside down, and as a result of that, they realized that they had to professionalize themselves more so than what they had. You know, there was no training. As a result of this scandal, training was required, supposedly required. It was written into the law. There was certain standards you had to meet in order to be employed that hadn't existed before. So you started to get a change at that particular point. But in reality, what they did, let's talk about the training. What they did then is they sent 4 police officers to the Metropolitan Police School in the District of Columbia to be trained. And they also, about a year later, what they did is they sent their first officer to the FBI National Academy, which is advanced police training. And then when that officer came back, he was supposed to be responsible for providing additional, what we now call in-service training. So here we have this law that says every police officer must be trained, but in reality, nobody else was, this was 1937, nobody else received any formal, like, recruit training up until 1951. We did, now there was in-service training going on by these people, this one officer that went through the National Academy. What the extent of that was, I don't know. So you had a lot that was written in, but in reality, it wasn't being followed, and that continued.
Got a lot of apprenticeship.
Yes, yeah, a lot of on-the-job training, yeah, a lot of on-the-job training.
So you almost approach 200 officers before you get a formalized training?
That's based on the,
Their first training, yes, okay. The first training, in-house training that they did on their own was provided, done in 1951. And all between 37 and 51, all of it was just OJT, on-the-job training, primarily. There might have been an individual who went to a school here and a school there. Politics continued to remain part of the hiring process up through the 1960s, I would say. And the only reason I say that is that when I came to work, I was asked, okay, how was I registered?
Really?
And that's all. And as long as you were registered as a Democrat, you that was acceptable. I can remember talking with people that came on maybe 2 or 3 years prior to my coming on, and they had to go up to Marlboro to sit down with one of the powers to be to see if they were acceptable. I didn't have to do that. I went through, an internal process to be. So that stayed in effect to a limited extent through the 1960s. We go back and we had talked about, lack of ability to conduct investigations. I'm aware of another case that occurred in 1935 where a young lady was murdered over in Mount Rainier, and they called in, again, the Baltimore City Police Department, and murders have always been there. There weren't that many of them, but they were always there, and they're interesting to read. They really are. And when they did occur, especially this one in 1935, a young lady by the name of Corina Loring, and she disappeared from her house one evening and was found 2-3 days later, 2-3 blocks from where she lived, and she had been strangled. And this was a big thing. This was, it's unbelievable the amount of newspaper coverage that this particular homicide received. They brought in 2 detectives from Baltimore City, and they were here for an extended, again, by reading the newspapers, you were able to determine that they were here for like a period of 6 or 7 months, and then a year later they were still coming down here to do some work on the case. They developed a suspect, although the suspect is never named in the newspapers. And the reason I can say that is because when you read the newspapers, it talks about the case being presented to the grand jury. It's not going to be presented to the grand jury unless they have a suspect. Nobody was ever indicted, but I think I know who did it today. I really do. In fact, there may very well be some people alive that you may be able to reconstruct it, yes, and it's kind of fascinating. And there's a massive amount of newspaper coverage on it. I mean, I started Xeroxing the newspaper articles, and I just had to stop. They just became too voluminous. There was a young lady that helped me in the beginning in some of my research, and she had always said she wanted to write a murder story, something that occurred. So I gave her all this. She never did anything with it, but I gave her all these newspapers, because you could really write it. And the unusual part about this is I went back and I interviewed the daughter of our third police chief, Ralph Brown. And she went and she pulled some old photographs out, which she gave me. And some of these photographs, she didn't know what they were. There was some writing on the back of them, and they were crime scene photographs from this particular murder. Okay, and it's quite interesting. It really is. It's quite interesting.
Is it because, or was it because of the crime, or was it anything to do with the individual and perhaps their
No, I think it was
family
because of the crime. It was. I think the suspect in the case was a relative. Okay, and it's and again, we had talked. One of the earlier remarks I had made was that the reporting back then was more objective. It was more matter of fact. And when you read this, it's really interesting to read. It's because there was almost no speculation. It was matter of fact reporting, and it was, again, you were able to derive quite a bit out of it. Again, I think the suspect was a relative, and there's still people around that remember that case, and I still think it would be. It's for me right now. It's too time consuming to get myself involved in something like this. But as you're doing this type of thing, all kinds of little sidebars arise. I told you earlier that I had the original photograph of the 6 police officers that I had contacted, all in their families, and it was an interesting thing to do. And there was one guy in there. His name was Claude Reese, and all I had was the name, Claude Reese, and I knew that he had been around for a while. So I had asked somebody, where was it? I asked Chief Schweitzer, who was hired in 1941. I had asked him one time. He was living in Florida when I really started on this, and I used to call him down in Florida, because he was very, very knowledgeable about a lot of things that went on. And he could remember stories that he had heard. So I talked to him one day, and I said, where was Claude Reese from? And he said, I think he was from Beltsville, I think. So that was a start. I went to a policeman that had lived in Beltsville for a number of years. And where would I go in Beltsville to find who this guy Claude Reese was? He said, well, you want to go to Joe's Barbershop, or you want to go to Boatler's Market. Okay, it might not have been Joe's, but it was Boatler's Market.
I know where that is.
Yeah. So I go to the barbershop, and the barber says that was before my time. I go down to Boatler's Market, and Mr. Boatler is there. Mr. Boatler was probably a man in his 70s at the time. And he says, that was before my time. But he says, I know that name. He says, I think, and I may not be correct, but I think his granddaughter comes in once a month and buys meat. He says, when she comes in next time, I'll ask her. And if it is his granddaughter, I'll give you a call. I think a week went by and he called me. It's the granddaughter. Here's her phone number. I call her up. She says, come on up. I said, okay. Go up there. And she's got a photograph that's in the book. It's and I've already got it. I mean, I've already had this photograph. I got it from the Machin family. Brilliant. But she says when he passed away that his daughter-in-law moved into the house, and she's got all kinds of material. And the daughter-in-law lives up here in Crofton. So she gives me the number, and I go up there. And hit a gold mine. This guy had been a constable from about 1923, 1924. He then became one of the original paid policemen in 1927, and he was rehired in 1931 as one of the 11 policemen, and then he was fired in 1937 as a result of the scandal that we talked about. But he was around during Prohibition, and that's what they did. I mean, there's two problems that arise in this county when you go back to the period of 1930 and beyond. Two big problems, gambling and liquor. They were the biggest problems in the county. And if you go back to the early 1900s, you still hear that. They used to run gambling boats out there and everything else. So bootlegging was a big thing during Prohibition, and
You had to supply Congress. You had to supply Congress.
oh yeah, sure, that was
I'm
it.
serious.
Yeah, bootlegging was
That's
a big
right.
thing. Yeah. Bootlegging was a big thing, and this guy, when he was a constable, would kind of concentrate on the bootleggers. And every time he got himself involved in something or made an arrest, there was a newspaper article about it, and he'd clip it out and put it in a scrapbook. So the scrapbook was that thick. It was really a gold mine. It was just a wealth of information. And that was the one really golden jackpot that I hit, in doing this, because that one scrapbook was just a wealth of information. You talk about sidebars, things that occur that you may want to take a look at, and you just don't have time to do it. When I was talking with Claude Reese's descendants, specifically his daughter-in-law and grandson, the grandson had just retired from being a guard up at the House of Corrections. And when I was at the house, he says, how much did they make back then? And we're talking about 1931. I said they made about $1,500 a year was what their salary was. And he says, well, there's a diary upstairs in the attic. And he said, it talks about sitting in the woods, and then he tells me what that means, sitting in the woods around a stakeout for bootleggers. And I said, gee, I'd like to see that. He says, well, when you come back, he said, I'll go upstairs and I'll pull it down for you. So I come back to the house a week or so later to return the scrapbook that they had lent me. And he sits me down and he says, the reason I asked you before about how much they were making is there's some notations in there about the transfer of money. And he says, who was the chief of police? And I said, a man by the name of Jeremiah Crowley. And he says, well, my grandfather gave Mr. Crowley about $5,500 in 1932 or 33 or something. And so, you just don't have time. I mean, it just opens up all kinds of things,
And thereby hangs the tale.
And we talked,
without it.
there was a different standard then. We talked earlier about Jimmy Lafontaine's gambling casino. There's some pictures in the book that came out of Claude Reese's scrapbook where that place was raided in 33, 34. There's a date on the photograph, if I'm not mistaken. And again, Lafontaine was there from 33, 34, right up through the late 40s. And the only time he was ever raided by the police was in 1934 when the Constables went in there and raided it. He was never raided by the police department. And again, there's a lot of information available about Jimmy Lafontaine. He was an extremely well-liked individual. Extremely well-liked individual. There's some good stories going around about him. There's a lot of documentation. An extremely wealthy individual. When he died, he was worth several millions of dollars. He died, I believe, in the early 50s. It's in the book. There's a picture in the book. And there's also information in the book about how much money he had when he died. And see, he was extremely wealthy individual. And there's a lot of information that you'll find about him But the reason the police department, he stayed open, not because of the police department, because of the, it's quite obvious, because they would have had difficulty getting in there anyways. I mean, there were only, in the 40s, there were less than 50 policemen, and they were all known. It wasn't like a policeman could go in there. The state police never went in there, okay? And the county police, I'm just telling you, I believe, were told, no, don't bother. He's not bothering anybody. And again, if you read it, the people that frequented there were well-to-do people for the most part. Blue-collar workers weren't prohibited. You could go in there as a blue-collar worker, but the story goes, and you're familiar with the stories, the blue-collar worker that goes in there, and he's making $40 a week or whatever, and he loses his entire paycheck. Well, the next day, the wife is coming there complaining to Jimmy, my husband lost his entire paycheck. I can't feed my kids. Well, he'd refer him to his attorney, Charlie Ford, I think it was, okay? And they'd go down to Mr. Ford's office, which was in the District of Columbia, and Mr. Ford would give them their money back with the proviso that the wife would supply a picture of her husband, and he was forever thereafter barred from going in there and gambling. And then the stories go around again, people being destitute in the neighborhood, that Jimmy would buy them coal so that they wouldn't, be cold during the winter and so forth. And, what he would do is there were constant complaints about his operations, but they came from people in the neighborhood. And it was because of the volume of cars and traffic that were created. And the grand jury looked at his operation a couple of times and never indicted him. And then as they got into the late 40s, period of 45, 46, 47, when the grand jury met, and it only met twice a year, he would close down for the 2 weeks that they met, okay? And then, as it got even hotter and hotter, he just voluntarily closed down in the late 40s. I think he closed it up in about 1948. But there's a lot of information available on him, and it's rather interesting to read. Talk a minute about the state police. State police go back to about 1913 or something like that as the commissioners. Police, meaning the Commissioner of Motor Vehicles, and their primary function in the beginning was to enforce traffic law. In fact, the law that created the state police specifically said that their only responsibility was to investigate traffic offenses, and they had no criminal arrest authority whatsoever. Okay, up until 1935. Now, the way they got around that was that the individual sheriffs could deputize them. So if the sheriff of Prince George's County decided that he wanted the state police to make arrests, a criminal arrest, he'd deputize them as deputy sheriffs, therefore giving them authority. For the most part, that didn't happen in Prince George's County. The sheriffs didn't want to make an arrest. Now, the only time that they were deputized is if something unusual happened, and on several occasions there was a need for a large police presence, and he would deputize them at that time. But for the most part, they weren't deputized. In 1935, legislation was enacted in Annapolis that gave them full law enforcement authority, where they were allowed to make criminal arrests. The police department didn't have any investigators up until about 1939, when they started a Bureau of Identification, and they started fingerprinting people and photographing people. And there were 2 officers assigned to that. Now, they also did special investigations, which means they investigated some of the criminal offenses, in addition to taking photographs and fingerprinting crime scenes and so forth. You go on up until about 1948, we actually start getting people that are assigned full-time as detectives. Okay, I kind of, have floated around all over the place. It was a slow process, and it was a difficult process. Again, we're going through something today where government is having trouble funding itself. History has a way of repeating itself. We go back to 1933, and all government county employees had to take a 10% pay cut back then. So history is kind of repeating itself. There has been an aversion here in Prince George's County against taxes, and I see that all the way through. You read it. You read analogies between this county and not this county and Montgomery County. And Montgomery County has always had a higher tax rate and has really provided its people with more of a public service than what this county had. I know for most of my career, Montgomery County has always had a larger police department than what Prince George's County had, up until probably the last 8 years when we've gone above them. Of course, our crime rate's also gone much higher than theirs. They were never adequately funded. The facilities were atrocious up until probably 8 years ago, when they really had no other choice. The facilities were so bad that they had no other choice but to build new facilities, and the facilities we have today are quite adequate, really. I want to open it up for questions. I've kind of really jumped around. Again, I didn't know what the audience was going to be. I thought we'd have a lot of people here that really weren't aware of what was going on here in Prince George's County, but everybody, I think, here has pretty much grown up here and has probably seen a hell of a lot more change than what I've seen.
I just want to make a comment about something before we get into the question. When there was discussion about the hundreds, and I mentioned a book just off the top of my head, but the book was by Louise Joyner Hinton.
She mentions it in there.
Right, it's called Prince George's Heritage.
Again, there's most of what I picked up on this was just going through old newspaper accounts. The only book that I found that really talked about, the sheriff from really the 17th century. It was a book about, I think that was the name of the title of the book, 17th Century Sheriff, which was written back, I think, in the 1920s. And I found that book in a, I'm not sure, there's a library in the Court of Appeals building up in Annapolis on Route Boulevard. And I just happened to go in there one day and found it on the shelf. But there's no definitive information about old-fashioned law enforcement. It's just not there. Now, somebody really could. There's a lot of documentation that I don't think has ever been looked at in the Hall of Records up in Annapolis. I think it was tremendous. But again, it's hit and miss. You could spend 2-3 days there and not come up with much of anything, just going through those boxes up there. A lot of what the sheriff did had nothing whatsoever to do with what we now call law enforcement. A lot of it was had to do with civil offenses and the collecting of fines and the operation of the jail in service of court papers.
More what the sheriff does today.
Yeah, today.
Today,
in reality.
more like the sheriff.
Yeah. There were people all the way along the lines. We talked about the constables, and there were people that came in there that were quite active in law enforcement. There weren't many of them, and some of them, I think, were rather professional. There was one individual by the name of Garrison, who's mentioned in the book, that was around for probably about 35 years. There was never a county policeman, but he ran a private detective agency, and his name continually appears as like a deputy sheriff. Another thing, I've talked about the sheriff, and you always have had deputies, but now we have, we probably have 200-300 deputies up there now. But when you're looking through the old newspaper accounts, it's almost always singular, deputy sheriff. So here you have the sheriff, and you've always had a deputy, but there probably was just one deputy, or maybe two, somewhere along the line.
The sheriff on vacation.
Yep.
Then there was Charles County, maybe other counties in the state still have an elected sheriff who is the police function. Was there ever any talk about absorbing the sheriff's function in Prince George County into the police department, or is that always been?
No, that's happened several times. I think the expense factor is, well, the expense and then the people, somebody's going to lose some power.
Right, it's always been.
There was a
back and
serious
forth.
effort to do that.
When you say expensive, the deputy sheriff's paid less, or not?
They're probably, they're paid a little, not much less. I'm probably saying a little bit less, but not much. At one time, there used to be
Yeah,
quite
it
a
used to
difference,
be.
but I don't think there's
I
that
don't know
much
what
of a
it is
difference
today.
anymore. When Ansel was the sheriff,
Yeah.
okay, Ansel wanted to merge the sheriff's department with the county police, but he wanted to come in as a lieutenant colonel,
Right.
and there was some opposition to that, and it just didn't happen. It probably never will happen. There's some talk now about there has been talk about merging the county police with the park police, okay, which in and of itself is a good idea, but it'll probably never happen. There's a big expense factor there.
How are the ranks established?
How is rank?
Yeah. So you wanted to come in as a lieutenant colonel.
Oh, well, I mean, you come in as a police officer, and right now, in order to be promoted, you have to have X amount of years in service, which really isn't that, it used to be bad, it's not that bad now. You have to come out and pass a promotional exam, and you have to get a satisfactory performance rating, and there has to be an opening there. But right now, automatically, you come in as a police officer, you're then promoted to police officer first class and then corporal. There's no limitation as to, there used to be a table of organization where they could only have maybe 100 corporals. Now, everybody can be a corporal. Okay, yeah. All you have to do is pass the promotional exam and get the satisfactory performance rating. But the sergeants, up to sergeant and above, then there's only X number of slots, and somebody has to either have to increase the number of slots or somebody has to retire.
Right. Who sets up that table?
The police department does, and it depends on how we're organized. At one time, we didn't have that many sergeants out there. Now we do. We probably had a sergeant for every 18 police officers. Okay, at one time. Now we've probably got a sergeant for every 12 or police officers. I would say 12 now.
What is a colonel the top?
Well, you have police officer. You have police officer first class. You have corporal. You have sergeant. You have lieutenant. You have captain. You have major, you have lieutenant colonel, and you have the chief. And you have one chief, obviously, and you have 3 lieutenant colonels, and you probably have about 15 majors.
Isn't that finally said in the budget, the number of personnel or the slots?
Yeah. It's
kind of
determined
taken care
by
of.
the police department, and then the amount of money that's available. It seems we had a lot of promotions. Now they're trying to cut back, so. They're doing away with some of the upper echelon ranks. The reason I'm retiring is that I'm at the top of my pay salary, and they're trying to get people like me out, and they'll bring somebody in. If they replace me at all, they'll bring somebody in at a lower salary. Okay, so it's the table of organization that exists within the police department, and that is also determined by the amount of money that's really available. Yeah. So again, questions. I've really jumped around much more than what I've wanted to, and I've probably overlooked quite a bit that I'll think about later. I say, gee, I wish I had said this, I wish I had said that.
You may have, you alluded to this just as I went out to stir up a few refreshments. You were talking about the municipalities and their police departments.
Yeah.
Do you see that, I know we live in a city that periodically says they're going to have one of their own, and unfortunately they've never quite gotten through. Do you think that more municipalities are likely to, or do you think that more of them are going to?
I don't think you're going to
absorb the
see,
other direction?
because of the expense factor,
Expensive.
I don't think you're going to see any more. There was a day, and again, you can't say this categorically across the board, there was a day when some of the municipalities weren't very professional. Okay?
That's for sure.
Okay, and it's true to a limited
true to
extent
some
today.
extent,
It
isn't
depends
it?
on which one you're talking
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
There's some out there that are very
Very.
very good.
But there are still
In fact,
some that are-
some that were bad years ago today are good.
Okay.
And I really see a tremendous improvement Generally.
Generally, that was
Generally.
going to be my next
Yeah,
question. How do
generally.
you rate, how
Yeah.
would you,
I would rate some of
them.
them as being extremely good. You used to have people that used to float around from one municipality to another. They'd get in trouble, and you still have a little bit
Yeah.
of that. You still have a little bit of it, but not much of it. Generally speaking, I have a lot of respect.
they
for
are
how-
reasonably professional.
Yes, yeah.
I know obviously
Some of
there's
them,
two or
yeah.
three that
And-
are
and
very
most-
professional.
Yeah, there's some of them, and even some that weren't so good are pretty decent today. Some of them are great. I'm going to tell you right now.
And you talk about the Police Institute, it's a community college that does a training program for that.
Yeah, now the
specialized?
community college, see, the county police for many years provided all of the police training to almost all of the municipalities, okay? You could go to any police academy within the state, and most of the municipal police went to our police academy. Some didn't because we weren't running a class, okay? But we ran quite a few classes, so most went to our police academy. Here a few years ago, we were doing a lot of hiring and we couldn't train the municipals. So what the community college did is the community college started their own municipal police training program, and they're running a good program. And it's a difficult thing to do, to set up a good training program. And as far as I know, I've never heard anything bad about their training program. I think like everything else, the first couple of classes you ran probably left a little bit to be desired, but they've got some good people up there, as far as I know. And they're doing their own training, they're doing their own in-service training. So I see a big improvement in the municipal police. I don't think that you're going to see, I'm surprised that you're saying that they're thinking of it, because it's just to me, it would just be
There's certain
tremendous,
elements that
horrendous
start talking about it that we,
expense, because it's tremendously expensive.
Why didn't they send their recruits to the University of Maryland Academy?
I don't know. They did for a while. There was a big expense factor there. As I recall, the University of Maryland was charging a lot of money, and some of these municipalities don't have a lot of money. Another problem they have with the municipalities, and they still have it to a limited extent, somebody will come in and you'll send them to a police academy for 4 months, 5 months, and then they come to work for you and they stay 3, 4, 5 months, 6 months, and then leave. Okay, and so the municipalities have a lot of money. Not only the salary that they paid them while they're there, but the tuition charges that they had. And the University of Maryland, I think, was rather high. I don't even know if is the University of Maryland still doing their own? Yeah. See, I don't know what happened. I remember when they started.
Train people from different.
They were, and I was in training, and we had helped the University of Maryland. In fact, they came over and took all of our lesson plans. And same thing with the community college. They come over and they took all of our lesson plans. We gave them to them. Really. And it's a difficult process because all of that is overseen now by the Maryland Police Training and Corrections Commission. Okay. And there's a lot of standards, instructional objectives that have to be met,
that was my
and
next
so forth.
question.
And you have to be able to prove that you met, I think, to say 366 instructional objectives that have to be met, and you have to be able to document how each one of these objectives were met. So it's a tremendous amount of work, especially for somebody that's just going into that now. Of course, we've got it all computerized, but in the beginning they were doing it by hand.
For your information, my brother-in-law is currently with the Buffalo Police Department. Of course, got involved with the recent marches and so forth on the abortion issue. But Buffalo would not hire him, nor would Prince George's County, as a police officer prior to having some experience. But he was able to get with the D.C. Police Department and go through their training program, no problem at all. And then he wound up transferring to Buffalo. This was, as I say, 21 years ago, 1971.
Now that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Because it all depends. See, now when we've hired, primarily we hire people that don't have any police experience at all. They're just, you know, it's a new job, totally new. They have no, primarily. There have been periods of time where we've hired what we call lateral transfers, and that's people that have been police officers someplace else, and they come in, and our academy, like right now, is probably almost 6 months long. But say back then, in 71, it was probably four months long, back in 71. Rather than run these people with previous experience through a 4-month police academy, what we did is we ran them through a reduced program of maybe a month and a half or 2 months, something along that line. And that may have been what was going on. It's difficult to put a class like that together, to get, say, 20 or 30 people at one time with experience. And we do it occasionally, but we probably run 5 of those through in the last 20 years or something like that. So, because ordinarily when they come in there, they have no experience whatsoever. Well, a lot of it's their first time they've ever had a job. So, yeah. So again, you know,
What
yes,
kind
sir.
of coordination is there any for any kind of disaster preparation if we were to have a major hurricane like we almost had a year ago, or there's, aside from the Maryland National Park and Police, Park Planning Commission Police, there are the various institutional police forces at the federal installations, the University of Maryland. There's the National Park Service, has a small constabulary in the area. Is there any kind of coordination on the disaster preparation level that brings these people
We have
together?
a disaster program that we implement when that occurs. I really don't know. There's got to be something. How active it is, I just can't tell you. Something that I see happening just recently is that we've had a rash of homicides. Homicides are very time-consuming type investigations. You develop a suspect and you can't find the suspect. And sometimes you put more time in trying to find that individual than you do to identify him. What we've done on several occasions recently is we've brought in people from the National Capital Park and Planning Police on a temporary assignment with us, and we've brought in sheriffs who would help us. That way we don't have to take one of our guys off the street, okay? You know, it's our detectives that are supervising them, telling them what to do, and so forth. But they have full law enforcement authority, and so I see more of that. That never happened a few years ago. It's happening now. I think there might be, they call them usually some type of task force or something. They've done it with drugs too. They've done it with drugs. We've brought in, and it seems to be, well, not seems, it is. It's park police and the sheriff's department. But there's a pretty good relationship as far as coordinating is concerned. There's a lot of like with training. And again, I spent 6 years in training. When I was in training, I came into training with no experience whatsoever as a trainer, and I came in as an administrator. I didn't actually go into the classroom. But I came in as an administrator and really was unfamiliar with what was going on, and so, you know, I sought help wherever I could find it. And, you know, somebody else, why recreate the wheel if it's somebody else has done all the legwork to put it together? So we put together a group of people from that met under the auspices of the Chiefs Council of Government's Chiefs of Police Steering Committee, and we met under their auspices. And we would meet once a month and exchange ideas and talk about problems. And there's a lot of that goes on. There's a tremendous amount of that goes on. We started that outfit probably 10 years ago, and I was quite active in it for about 6. And then I left training, and of course, you know, but I ran into the guy that is now was in the organization when I was in it. He remained in training, and he's been president of that subcommittee for the last 4 or 5 years, and it's still just as active today as what it was. And they exchange ideas. They're running a training program. Maybe Fairfax County Police Department is running a training program that we haven't been able to run. So they'll give us seats. So they'll call us up, and if you want a seat in the program, you know, and you exchange a lot. There's a lot of that goes on. There really is. There's a good exchange of information between police agencies for the most part. State police run a lot of training programs. I hope I've been able to enlighten you a little bit. Like I said,
Very informative. Very.
I'm gonna sign some books.
I was chairman of the Prince County Planning Board in 1967, 68 after the Martin Luther King assassination, and we deployed our complete our police under the jurisdiction of the
Yeah.
county.
At one time, we had it was probably it's not there now, but we had a communications room set up for disasters, and we had representatives from the park police and the state police, the sheriff's department.
I just remember thinking what's happening along that line now because of the increase in the police force center. I'll tell a little anecdote which I don't often